Actually, I've invited you all here today so I can exercise my Tony Robbins fantasy. I wanted one of those things with the thing out here, and I was going to stride up and down the stage. I found out nobody uses those anymore because these little guys are so good, there's no reason to. So that went out the window. So what the heck, I'll go talk about the entrance to town anyway. Can't talk about the entrance to town without talking about the peculiarities of Aspen, Colorado. Before starting on the production of, watching the entire presentation at the Wheeler Opera House, I wanted to say a few words about why we're doing what is essentially a new version of the original edit or the original program. We recorded this on February 15th in the Wheeler Opera House, and there was a municipal election in Aspen on March 7th, 3 weeks later. Everybody was a bit surprised to learn that I wasn't doing it for that upcoming election. It was a timing, I don't know if coincidence is quite right, but I was really looking at a longer term in terms of the value of putting this together. We went ahead and rushed a version onto YouTube because I was sort of curious to see if any of the candidates for office on March 7th would take the opportunity to comment on what we had done. It would have been pretty quick. They would have had to make up their mind in, 24 hours or so. So no, that did not happen. And there was nothing about any of the people who ended up on this council that made me think that we have much to work with in terms of enlisting their aid in finally resolving this issue. So I've very much been focused on the next election, which will be in March of 25. For one thing, Tory will be term limited out. It will be a true open seat. No incumbent that you have to beat. So this is really intended going forward to be first and foremost a recruitment tool. And I'm calling on everybody in this valley and the two neighboring valleys to put their thinking caps on. Think about everybody you know who lives in Aspen, Colorado. Think about whether they have a little bit of administrative or management experience or just are good public speakers, whatever. But most of all, people who can follow this entire video, get to the end and say, that makes perfect sense. Let's do that. So that's our first task, really, is to find people for that upcoming election in a little less than 2 years. I know that sounds like a long time. Keep in mind, I started in 1984 on this particular issue. So to me, it just sounds like the right amount of time to get the planning done. Get people in place. If we got that done in the next 3 or 4 months, that'd be fine. Those same people who want to run could show up at all these upcoming meetings, which I assume are going to happen, because the city keeps claiming they want to do another election. Now, one of the questions that'll come up, particularly for anybody who chooses to run for office, is why aren't they going to have an election and have the people vote on this one more time? And the simple answer is, it doesn't do anything. That's not what this is about. The election was just to approve the use of open space. It doesn't have anything to do with federal or state requirements for building a highway. And in fact, the federal and state government doesn't use elections to determine what to do about a highway. The brand new bridge over the Colorado River didn't require any votes of the people. And oh, by the way, that is Highway 82. So the whole point here is to try to get things back into their normal lanes, if you'll excuse the pun, which is that the elected officials can use whatever method they want to determine what you, the public, wants to see happen. But ultimately, the decision and the action has to be taken by the elected officials. So let's start with the part that matters and get elected officials in there who understand the whole situation, start to finish, will claim that what they want to do is exactly what you will be seeing on this video. And in that respect, it's going to be a bit of a guidebook, a step-by-step. This is how you get an entrance built that will greatly, dramatically reduce the traffic congestion in the entrance to town. So very quickly, this is what we're aiming for. This is what we're hoping that other people will be inspired to get involved to do. And this is why this is the right way to do it. So with that, I'll think about whether I'm going to come back and have a closing statement. Maybe I don't need it. Maybe you're going to understand this so well that by the time you get to the end of this video, I couldn't reach you one way or the other. You're either on board or you're not. But sit back. It's a little longer than most films you'll see of this type. We hope it's mildly entertaining. If you have any interest in public policy, the history of Aspen, there's lots of things you'll find interesting and maybe even fun. So whatever you like to do when you go to the movies, pop some popcorn, get your favorite libation, sit back, relax, and we hope you'll enjoy the show. Thank you. I blew into town in 1970, and I hitchhiked into town, and I rode in a VW bus. Now, if that isn't the most appropriate story you've heard recently, I don't know what I can do for you. Anyway, they had built the platform in the back where they slept, and there were no seats, so I laid out on the platform and promptly fell asleep. Came all the way to Aspen over Independence Pass, missed the whole thing. First view I had of Aspen, Colorado was looking down Hyman Avenue from what was then Tom's Market. Actually, it might have been still the post office, I don't remember. Towards the Wheeler Opera House, that one block section. Of course, way before malls or anything else. It was this is summertime, it was a madhouse. More cars, people, dogs, whatever. I mean, the whole street was just alive. It was a week later that the guy where I was, at the dormitory basically, where I was staying, decided he was going to go out to the lumber yard out at the Airport Business Center, asked me if I wanted to drive along. So we went rolling along out down Main Street, and all of a sudden we make a right-hand turn. I said, well, what did we do that for? I mean, the road's going that way. Then we make a left-hand turn. We go over the bridge, and I look back and go, what was that about? Well, it turns out that throughout the 50s up until 1960, the town had really wanted everyone to be able to go straight out of town over a new bridge over Castle Creek. And in 61, the state finally got around to building a new bridge, and they said, no, you can't have it straight out Main Street because we don't have that much money. It's a much narrower span over on Hallam Street, so that's where you're going to get your new bridge. So the city continued to agitate, and by that I mean everybody, not just the government, for the next, 8 or 9 years, until the state came back and said, oops, we guess you were right. However, we just built this bridge, so we're not going to replace it right away. And I guess we should probably start with the slides, if we could, Michael, because our first slide is going to speak to that very thing. The reason I decided to take it back to 1960 is because in 1969, Aspen, the Aspen Times was nice enough to put this little blurb on their front page. And basically it talks about how it says, what a difference 9 years make. I think we can all assume that traffic volumes went up rather dramatically between 60 and 69, because the state came back and said, well, you know what, I guess we probably should have put that. However, we're going to start by putting a 4-lane from Castle Creek on down to Jerbausdale. So even then, they kind of put off putting a new entrance in. Peggy Clifford was she was a managing editor and columnist for the Aspen Times. And in late 1969, she wrote a very virulent anti-highway. And she was talking about how traffic volumes had reached 4,000 to 4,400 vehicles a day. And it was the equivalent of carnage. Well, I keep wondering what you would think of 23,000 cars a day. I guess that's, I don't know, apocalypse squared or something. Once you get past carnage, it's hard to imagine. But obviously there are different perceptions then that we start to take into account when we look at this stuff. Anyway, like I said, I arrived in 1970, and that very first year, there was a vote on the entrance to town. And it was close. It was 1,830. I almost want to run off and go grab the notes, but I don't need them. It was close. It was 1,830 to 1,600 and something. And for a countywide vote, it was fairly close. In favor of a 4-lane all the way down Valley. Now, I had just come from California. I was a little skeptical. I was, do you sure you want to do that? Because I was so used to freeways being getting built everywhere. I was going, geez, out here too? What are you thinking? And now as the years went by, I figured it out. But so that was my first introduction. So over the years, I've gone back and looked more and more at 1969, which was one hell of a watershed year. Back then, the city would have their elections in the odd-numbered fall period. County would have theirs on the regular general election on the even-numbered fall election. And in '69, a new group popped up called Citizens for Community Action. And one of the prominent members of that was a guy by the name of Joe Edwards. A lot of you here will remember that name. He was very influential for a very long time. And they were quite the anointed group from the very start. They had a full front page story. Now at the time, the Aspen Times was a weekly. I think for 4 or 5 weeks before the election, they had a full page story. And Peggy Clifford wrote this incredibly anti-highway thing, and their whole thing was they didn't want to do that. They didn't want the state going here and four-laning the entrance, or anything else for that matter. So it was a tad amusing that after they got sworn into office, I think it was January 12th, it took them exactly 17 days to tell the state, and I'm not kidding you, to please hold off on building the new highway while they studied mass transit alternatives. So the entrance to Aspen really truly is a 52-year failed experiment. No exaggeration. The very first time they asked the state to hold off, it was so they could study mass transit. Now, one of the things I did tonight was I was very involved from like 1984 through 95, and I'll explain that in a minute. But during that period, I went to all the meetings. I collected all the handouts. I collected all, right down here. I was going to move this pile before I came out. That's all the official stuff. These are like prepared by the state of Colorado, and we have the entrance to Aspen final environmental impact statement. We have drafts. We have supplemental drafts. We have the portion from Down Valley to Buttermilk. That's the official material. Over here spread out on these tables are studies, various engineering groups that were contacted and contracted and put out every conceivable thing you could study. And you're all invited to come out during the break and just go through these. One of my goals in doing this is that all of that is probably going to go to the Aspen Historical Society. I have no impact on what's gone on since I originally got very involved in 1984. But you'll notice that I just jumped from 1970, in which we had an election, to 1984. Well, I was young, and I was in Aspen, and I was having a blast, and I can't tell you what the hell was going on between 1970 and 1884. I don't know. But I do know that they were enforcing parking regulations in a way that was totally incoherent and totally random. So I went and complained to the city, and at that time, if they had more than 3 or 4 people come in and harass them about the same subject, they'd put them on a committee. They'd give them a staff member, they'd meet for a while, they'd put out a final report, everybody'd say, wow, that was fabulous, what a wonderful citizen you are. They put the study on the shelf, and they'd all go away happy. So I got roped up in one of those things. Well, is it time? Oh, I forgot to mention this second newspaper article, and again, at some point in the next week or two, this is all gonna go on the website, which is entrancesolution.com. They got the council votes twice on the highway. Well, all that says is they asked the state to hold off. So what I just told you can be verified in that particular article. The next one over is that '69 was a big battle for a place on city council. And you'll notice, if you can make it out, that lovely interchange up there. That's what Joe Edwards was telling everybody the town would be facing unless they elected him to put a stop to it. And I decided at this point, early on, I was going to jump 20 years ahead. This is what the state finally proposed. So there's the reality, and there's the boogeyman. So that's why we're calling this reality versus City of Aspen, because the reality is a highway is a highway. We don't need more than a 4-lane highway. We'll get to that in a minute. It doesn't need to do anything other than come straight into town. We bought the Merle Thomas properties solely to be able to do that. Not solely, it's a nice place to have some open space. The whole idea was that
If you can push people's buttons, you can get votes. Joe didn't quite make it. He came up 6 votes short, and Eve Homeyer was elected mayor. Regardless, like I said, it took him exactly 17 days to get that new council together and put a stop to the highway. So sometime in the 80s, 86 or so, well, I'll go back to 84, I got on the traffic committee. And within weeks of us putting together the traffic committee, we're supposed to look at ways of reducing congestion downtown. Within weeks, they held another election. By a rather overwhelming margin, everybody voted for a 4-lane in the valley. So we kind of looked at each other and said, well, I guess we know what we'll be doing. We weren't even sure if we should bring it up because it was one of those things everybody said, oh, nobody knows what they want to do. Oh, it'll never get solved. That was in 84. So over the course of a year and a half, we had 12, 13 people, and it was amazing. They pretty much showed up every week or two. We did have a facilitator. It was a guy by the name of Tom Baker. He's not the current head of the local Republican Party. This is a different Tom Baker. Great guy. He was new in town. And we were probably the last such committee to look at the entrance without a facilitator there to make sure that we came up with the right solution. Every process they've done then has been totally stage managed, totally prearranged. I mean, they put these people through a ringer and make sure they come out with the right answer. We were probably the last ones who didn't do that or didn't have to do that. So we had unfettered access to city staff. It was the Colorado Department of Highways at the time. They became CDOT later on in order to add the transportation element to the highway, or the highway planning. And we went through, believe it or not, 19 different options for what to do at the entrance to town. And I'm very sorry I didn't save them all. I'm sure it'd make a great display these days. But we were thorough. We looked at everything you could possibly look at. And we were all done. We basically came up with what you're seeing on the far right. Lots of other people like split pairs and, everything you can imagine. Interchanges like the one that Joe Edwards was afraid of. You can see here, I don't want to go too far ahead. What do we got over here? We got the EIS newsletter. Okay, well, prior to us meeting, the state had begun an EIS process. I should have mentioned that in 1969, the other big thing that happened was the National Environmental Protection Act, which is why suddenly there had to be an environmental impact statement for every major project that you wanted to use federal money. So that was the other thing that really complicated things. It wasn't just us chickens talking to the state anymore. So they came out with the draft, August 1989. They had relied on our work on the entrance pretty heavily. I mean, they listened to what we had to say, and they knew we had consulted with their engineers, and everybody, it was a very productive process, I thought. And lo and behold, what we finally thought was the best solution is what they ended up putting in their draft as the preferred alternative at that stage of the process. Now, there's certain key words you have to know, preferred alternative being one of them. Fully evaluated option is another. You have a draft, and then after a while, you have a final, and sometime after that, you have a record of decision. Once you have a record of decision, that's supposed to be what the state uses to go build whatever it is you decided. A lot of people have been under the misconception for a very long time that the state or the feds pick the, quote, best option, and that's what they put in the record of decision. Doesn't exactly work like that. What the feds do is make sure that every viable option is included in the analysis. And if it's viable, they go through the whole process. When you're done, you call it fully evaluated, and then local decision makers can pick from amongst those choices. It was never intended that a record of decision would still have those choices. The idea was by the time you got to that stage, that your local community would have picked what they wanted, and the state would go ahead and start building, if not the next year, certainly the first year they had the money. Well, here things went a little differently. What was intended to be an 18-month process, as you can see, just to get the draft out, took over 2 years. We currently have a record of decision for the entrance to Aspen, which is 23 years old and has yet to be acted upon. I don't know what the record is, but we've got to be close. For an EIS process with a record of decision that leads to nothing, I'm not sure of a better example. So one of the things I've been telling people, if you know these friendly neighborhood billionaires with a whole legal team on retainer, they could actually do some good, not just for the entrance, but to help clean up the whole EIS process. Because all along here, I'm going to be stopping and saying, how is that even possible? And the problem is you don't know whether it's possible because there's no one to ask. There's not really an expert on NEPA processes in all the different places that an EIS can be applied, everything from water to highways to you name it. If you want a question definitively answered about an EIS process, you have to ask a federal judge. So again, unless you have a friendly neighborhood billionaire in your back pocket, it's entirely likely that you just have to wing it. And a lot of this is like, I hate to say this, but our system of government is that the government can do whatever it pleases. Because if nobody challenges it, they just go ahead and do it. So really, under the NEPA process, whatever they decide to do, they can do unless somebody raises their hand and says, okay, I'm going to go in and ask a federal judge whether this is all right or not. That's not what people are expecting with a NEPA process.
After the draft EIS for the whole alignment between Basalt and 7th Street was released, we had these illustrations to look at. Expanding the highway on the existing alignment causes the loss of the reading room building at the corner of 7th and Main Street, and some other stuff has to be moved. But all the traffic moves along the same route that it does now. The state eventually dropped this option due to safety and community acceptability concerns, and that was their language.
The second one was this illustration, which they called the direct connection, which splits off from the existing alignment, goes across the new bridge, connects up with 7th Street. Cemetery Lane, then, the connection between Hallam and the highway would have been taken out. Cemetery Lane winds around, and the light that's currently at Cemetery Lane gets moved over to 7th and Main. It was a little unwieldy that people on Cemetery Lane who wanted to go down Valley had to go all the way into town, turn around, and come back out, but nobody seemed to bother, and it didn't seem to bother anybody. Because what they loved about it is that before this was built, you drive into town with a golf course on one side, open space on the other. After you move the alignment, you drive into town with a golf course and open space on one side and open space on the other. The other thing that's really kind of nice about this is you come around at that angle, you go by the Merle barn. I mean, you're going to go through a little ranch from the 1890s with the Merle barn, and you're looking directly at Shadow Mountain. These days, when you come to town, you look into these folks' living room right here on the left on the other side of the river. So it was a very different entrance. Everybody who wasn't afraid of change has thought it would be a very lovely way to enter town. Based on those two illustrations, we had probably the best informed electorate we had ever had. Nobody was unclear on the concept. Everybody knew what they were voting on. Well, do you want to have a 4-lane highway? That's the first question, on one of two alignments. In other words, let's settle whether you want to have a 4-lane or not first. For the question, 1,740. Against the question, 816. I don't know about you, I've never seen a margin like that in an election. This is this local community that can't seem to make up its mind. Oh, my God, it's just an endless, controversy. And yet they voted for a 4-lane by 1,740 to 816. Then the second question was, which alignment do you like? You want to leave it on the existing alignment, or you want to build the new bridge and have a new way into town? That was a little closer, but still we're looking at 1,475 to 1,042. That's still an enormous margin. Now, one of the things, I keep referring to the people who really run this place. I don't know who they are. And maybe it's a false concept, but on the other hand, I don't think so. It wasn't an accident that citizens for I've already forgotten the name, Citizens for Community Action were treated like royalty in the newspapers. and had all of their meetings over at the Aspen Institute. My God, you would have thought they were the government. Well, let's go back to 1984 for a second. Both of those questions were like 80% in favor of a highway. So you had that vote. You were soon to have this vote. In between, we had an election where they didn't split it up this way. They just assumed, well, everybody wants a 4-lane highway, so let's just ask people, which alignment do you want? This is the little thing that happens in a democracy when you have 3 points of view and you're trying to come up with one answer. Because we've always had a committed 25% who want the no-build option. They don't want anything to change. They want it to stay exactly the way it is today, the exact way it was in 1984, et cetera, et cetera. You've got about another quarter that wants it to go along the existing alignment, and you've got a solid half or a little more that think, let's build the highway over a new alignment, get the S-curves out of there. So what happens, anytime you put those two together, the people don't want anything, get together with the people who want something different, and they vote down whatever is the preferred alternative in this case. Now, once the folks who wanted nothing discovered this, they went, aha. And they have been in control of the situation here for 50 years. And there's so many different ways to work this. If it's not enough to have a controversy between two alignments, well, then you can have a controversy between buses or rail. You can have a controversy between this and that. And over again, they've structured elections to reach a no-build conclusion. And it's not that hard to do once you know what you're doing. There's talk about the 25 elections that have supposedly been held. I would contend that every election since 1990, which is when this was done, every single election has been some attempt by the people who are actually in control of this place to overcome this result. Anyway, this is what they're proposing now, which is also what they were proposing then. This is slightly different, alignment. This was a pure rail proposal, but in any sense, that was intended to be a 2-lane highway with light rail. Problem is, nobody could figure out how you were going to afford light rail. It's wildly expensive. But the idea was that if you tell people are going to go through the rural property, but the traffic jam will be just as bad as it is today, what do you think they're going to do? They're going, no, I don't want that. I want the traffic jam to either get better or go away entirely, which of course will never happen. But boy, oh boy, could you make it substantially better. So what they are doing right now, as near as I can tell, is that they're putting us through this same process one more time. They're going to try to convince the voters to vote for using the rural property, but having the exact same traffic jam when you're done. The difference being they do want to put a 4-lane in and reserve one of the lanes for buses. Well, if you reserve one of the lanes for buses, you've still got a 2-lane highway. The problem with Highway 82 is the lane capacity is insufficient for the demand. That's 3-dimensional reality. Oops, there's that word again. If you do not expand the amount of lanes for general traffic, you will continue to have a significant traffic backup. We've been through this enough. I don't know if there's anybody left that doesn't know that. So I purposely have not allocated a whole bunch of time to talk about highway mechanics. If I get any questions, I'll do that after our little break. But I'm not committing any time to it. I think everybody gets it. If you got 2 lanes coming down any old highway doing 55 miles an hour, and you suddenly cramp it down into 1 lane that goes 30 miles an hour out the other side, you will have a traffic jam, assuming there's any traffic volume at all. So everybody knows that now. And the people who want nothing have figured out a way to complicate the issue to the point where a lot of people that just think, well, it can't be solved. After all these years, you got to be kidding. But think back to 1970, where you had a new council come in and solve the problem in the space of 19 days. You could do that today. There's nothing complicated about this. It's a highway. Everybody knows where it needs to go. Everybody knows you got to have 2 additional lanes for general traffic. The state at some point, if it had wanted to, could have enforced its authority and just come in and condemned the land and built it. They have no particular reason to do that. They've got people all over the state who are after them for highway money. Why would they go, spend it up in Aspen where everybody tells them to go away? But of course, not everybody has told them to go away, just the elected officials. Anyway, I will explain to you how it is possible that a new council could resolve this in approximately 19 days, a couple of meetings. And I also want to stress it's got nothing to do with the upcoming election. The reason I'm doing this at this time is because when they announced they were going to spend the city announced it was going to spend $150,000 to get people up to speed on the entrance to Aspen. And I said, no, they're not. They're going to spend $150,000 to tell you ridiculous stories that aren't true. So I wrote a letter to the editor and I said, for 1% of that, if somebody will rent me the wheeler, I will go and tell people the truth. Well, a couple of months ago, a random rich guy got a hold of me and said, well, I'll do that. I said, great. So I got the date and got the theater rented. And then he said, well, no, I've changed my mind. I'm not going to do that. Well, by then I said to myself, well, it's got to happen sometime because I want out of this. I want to do it once, put everything I know on a videotape. That way, if anybody wants to come along behind me and have some small chance of understanding what's been going on here, they can find it all in one place. The other nice thing about this having gone on for so long is most of the questions have been, as they say, adjudicated. It's been to the courts. There's not much to argue about anymore. And this is a perfect example. At one point, they decided they wanted to put bus lanes between Buttermilk and the roundabout. And of course, since that was not part of the original plan, state said, well, you're going to go back and get a new authorization for that approval you got to use open space land. So they said, okay, and they went off and did that. So they got sued. And friends of Merle Park said, you can't do that. You have to have a whole supplemental EIS. You can't just on your own do what they did back in 1970, which is have your elected officials make a decision and follow through. What a concept. So they went to court. And the court sided with the city and said, no, you can have bus lanes because that was I've forgotten the term already, fully evaluated option. And as long as it's fully evaluated, you can go ahead and build it under the EIS, even if it wasn't the, quote, preferred alternative. So it was nice to have that little bit of information. That's helped a lot over the years that we know at least that much, because we got a federal judge to tell us so. However, the reason the city stopped the authorization at the roundabout is not even they thought they could get approval to bring those bus lanes through the Merle property. People aren't going to do that because they know it's still going to be a two-lane highway. So they didn't even have the gumption to try to get approval for their own plan. They stopped at the roundabout, and that's what we've been living with now for quite some time. That's why I find it so amusing. They're back again, going to put that same thing on the ballot, because at this point, the Castle Creek Bridge, the one we use every day, has got to be replaced. It's about to the end of its 75-year design life. The state would really like, basically they don't care, but God, would they love to be able to solve this so you'd have a new route into town, so when they replace that bridge, they're not having to deal with 23,000 vehicles a day while they're building a new bridge from scratch. This is not something they're looking forward to. So what's going on now is the city is going to run a new election, which based on previous outcomes on this exact same question has been voted down numerous times. I believe for the sole purpose of getting it voted down again, so they can go to the state with their hat in hand going, oh, we tried so hard. The people of Aspen just can't come to any conclusion about what they want to do with that entrance. And the state's going to get stuck, or unless they grow a backbone, trying to rebuild the existing bridge and still figure out how to get 23,000 vehicles in and out of town. That's where I think it's all going. Now, if all this sounds very conspiratorial to you, I don't care. It's a small town. It was really small in 1969 and 70 when all of this got started. Because I think it's been really crazy to have this happening, not only because of what it's done to the EIS process, which has made it look like a shambles, not only to the fact that entire lifetimes of people's time has been wasted, and not only because it's one of the ugliest, most polluting messes I've ever seen in any town anywhere. I continue to plug away at it. And I had a friend tell me, well, you know, once the traffic jam moves all the way up to the entrance to town, you don't have to do anything. People won't stand for it. They'll demand that it be fixed. No, they won't. Aspenites don't demand anything of their government. I was telling somebody earlier that works here, I said, I mean, there are countries that are so totalitarian that if you go out and demonstrate against the government, you'll disappear. There's no danger of that here. And yet you still can't get any significant number of people to get hotted up enough to say, look, enough of this crap, fix the entrance. We know how. It's all been through the process. It's all been to the courts. You could, in the first 2 weeks that you go in with a new council, change the right-of-way agreement. Believe it or not, after all I'm telling you all of this comes down to one document. I feel like the guy on TV telling they can steal your mortgage, steal your house. It all comes to one document that's controlling this entire situation. And that document came about because, as part of putting the highway through the Maroldt, which was voted on, we did a land exchange between the city and the state. City gave up approximately 4 acres, I don't know the numbers exactly, 3 or 4 acres, something like that, across the Maroldt property for a right-of-way for the new highway. And the state gave us 33 acres out by Brush Creek in 82. I think that's a general area where we all park when there's a special occasion. I'd have to check to be sure, but that's the basic idea. So the land's already been transferred. All the votes have already been taken. We have a pretty good idea what the courts are going to say, but I'll get back to that in a minute. What you don't have is 3 people on city council who go ahead and do it. Just change the right-of-way agreement. Can we do the next slide, Michael? Now, the other thing that happened I didn't mention earlier, but in 1984, while we were, just after we got actually I think I did mention it, but when we first sat down as a committee, the traffic committee, there had just been a vote. And this is a list of all the votes, city and county, that you can find on the Colorado State website. So if you're feeling conspiratorial, you can go down here, May 1983, we have a vote, another vote, 83. All of a sudden we jump to 86. 84 vote isn't up there. They just skipped over it. Even though it was about as decisive as anything you'll ever see. When you get 80% of the public saying, yeah, build a highway, everyone would normally expect that's what happens next. Didn't happen here. They just ignored it and continued on. And these days, the state doesn't even bother to put it up there. But it's probably a simple oversight, of course. At the time, I was working with a group. A group had formed to try to get past this nonsense, and we called it Common Sense Alliance. And for a while, I was the spokesman and treasurer. And at the time, we were able to raise considerable amount of money for various projects. And one of them was to poll the electorate. We got an actual polling firm out of Denver. And they had a hell of a time. They went in promising a certain percentage of registered voters would be polled. By the time they were done, they had to call just about every single registered voter on the list in order to get us the percentage they promised. So it wasn't so much polling the community, you were polling the portion of the community that was willing to talk to a pollster. But still, we found out right away that nobody liked anything except 4 lanes plus a rail line. In other words, Aspenites are like everybody else in the United States. They wanted everything. Well, for years, the rail had been treated like an either-or option. The rail was supposed to be put in place of a 4-lane highway. So it was another time that nobody wanted to see those results. They kind of all rolled their eyes and go, no, you can't have a 4-lane and rail. The rail is so we don't have to give you a 4-lane. So anywhere along the line, you would have thought that somebody would have given up and just gone ahead and built the highway, but it hasn't happened. They're resilient, these folks, whoever the heck they are, and they keep doing the same thing over and over again. They keep getting the same results, and that's nothing happens, and we're stuck with that god-awful mess coming in and out of town, which is so predictable and so obvious, and the solution for it is so clear. I tell people all the time, this is the single simplest public policy question that I've ever heard of. And that all these different techniques have been used to make it appear that, one, really complicated, and two, oh my God, the people just don't know what they want to do, and on and on. Because I can assure you right now, there are two documents that actually matter here. One's a record of decision, and the other is the right-of-way agreement. That was a kind of a side rider or something to the land exchange. Every other piece of paper on these tables, or in those boxes, I couldn't even find enough room on the tables, represents government waste at its worst. And it represents a feeding trough for all the people who are in the transportation, what's it called? Coordination, consultancy. Anybody who's in the transportation consultant business just loves this. And you look at the titles and you read what they're about and you go along and you try to relate that all of what you see down there in one way or another was all devolved out of this process of people who didn't want change. They wanted to keep the status quo. And they've gone off into exotic things, rail lines. I mean, you can't put a rail line in this valley. There's 70,000 people. When it reaches 1 million, give me a call and we'll talk about a rail line up and down the Roaring Fork Highway. It's just it's the type of thing that should have lasted 10 or 15 minutes at a scoping meeting at some early transportation committee. But because it's a way of splitting up the electorate, one more way of splitting up the electorate, it's remained in the mix. And right now, it's still considered, quote, the preferred alternative for the entrance to Aspen, even though that preferred alternative has sat there for 23 years without being acted upon. Well, that's not a record of decision. And again, let's get back to your friendly neighborhood billionaire. That's another thing you could take up with a federal judge and say, what are we talking about here? You can't just sit here for 23 years and still claim this is the preferred alternative. Now we get into purpose and need. This is really fun. You start off all the way back in 87 and look at what they issued in 89. It talks about the purpose and need. Well, the purpose is the highway is dangerous and it's incredibly congested, and the purpose is to increase capacity on the highway and make it safer. That's it, folks. That's the whole thing. It's real simple. That's what the state set out to do. That's what they told the feds. That's what they set out to do. And the feds said, based on that, we'll give you the money, do the EIS, come back to us. Those are perfectly good, sound reasons to expand a highway. Well, somewhere along the line, when the writing was on the wall, I picture the warehouse scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Huge stacks of material all the way to a ceiling, rows so long you can't see the end of them. And I really think that somewhere down in Denver, in a warehouse for CDOT that looks a whole lot like that, there sits a copy of the completed, quote, final version of the EIS for the Basalt to Aspen, which literally went all the way to 7th and Main Street in Aspen, that's complete with the exception of probably a signature page. Well, it became so obvious that they were about to release that final that in the next city election, along comes John Bennett. And he wants to start a whole new process. No, we need to study this a little longer. What came out of that was they literally truncated the EIS. They stopped it at Buttermilk and created a whole new process from Buttermilk into town. Well, here's another place. It would be really interesting to have your friendly neighborhood billionaire ask a federal judge, can you do that? Nobody knew of a situation before. And at the time, we kept going, what procedures or laws or rules or what are you acting under that you're doing this? Never got an answer. So some years later, again, we had money for things like surveys and lawyers. Lawyer checked it out and he said, it's all the same process. He says, yeah, they can say they split it. Sure, they split it. They can come up with new pages that look a lot like the other pages, But once that initial EIS started, and it named the project area, everything that's happened after that is all part of the same process. But let's take a short break right here, and then I'm going to get into why, under the EIS process, you could solve this in 19 days if you get the right people on the Aspen City Council. How's that for a tease? We did a program here. When I say we, once upon a time, back when we had money, we were calling ourselves Common Sense Alliance, and we did a program here in 1999. I was going to ask somebody, apparently I have a YouTube channel. Who knew? I've got about 4 things up on YouTube. I guess that makes a channel. I can't tell you how to get to my channel, but if you go to entrancesolution.com in about a week, all the links will be up so you can watch that previous program that we did. And that was all about rail. John Caldera came up from Denver and spoke. And we had a gentleman by the name of Wendell Cox who came in and spoke. John was, good. He said, if you think you're going to reduce, traffic volumes with a rail line, stop kidding yourself. And then Wendell got into the real nitty-gritty of what you were in for if you wanted to try to build a rail line in an area with such a low population. Anyway, I highly recommend it if you're really concerned with the public policy aspect of this. If you're only concerned with the fact that you'd really like to be able to come in and out of town without having to sit there for 30 or 40 minutes in a traffic jam, it might not be that interesting. But if you have any interest whatsoever in how rail, and again, keep in mind, these are products we're being sold. And you better believe there are people who would love to sell us a rail line between here and Glenwood Springs. That doesn't mean they're your friend or that they're telling you the truth. When you start talking about $600–700 million, people fudge a little bit. So I would recommend Wendell Cox to you. And I stayed in touch with Wendell for a considerable period of time, probably another 3 or 4 years after that. And at one point I came across a really interesting website on the DOT site, which is the, of course, Federal Department of Transportation. And they had a list of all sorts of places that had transit systems that were getting federal assistance. And they would list the population and the amount of money they were spending on transportation. And you could do the math pretty easily. And I discovered, as near as I could tell, and this is a while ago, I'm sure it's the case now, that I could only find 2 jurisdictions in the United States that were spending more per capita on mass transit than we were right here in the Valley. And the only reason for that is because, well, with San Francisco and New York, they both have extensive rail systems as part of their mass transit. Other than that, as far as a bus-based system, I think we're the prize winners. Now, interestingly enough, the feds didn't do that map because they don't even bother to keep track of jurisdictions this small. I think the smallest city on there was around 50,000 people. So that was a bit of an eye-opener. Anyway, I decided to do the work and figure out about what percent, with all that transit, what percent of the person trips in the valley was RAFTA providing. I came up with about 4%. So I wrote to Wendell. I said, Wendell, it looks like the local bus system is handling up to 4% of the local person trips. And he said, no, that's impossible. He said, in the United States, you never get anything more than somewhere between 0.5% and 1.5%. So I explained to him why it might be different here. We've, shipped all of our workforce out of the area. It's a, single valley, single line, all that. And finally he said, well, even in Europe, where everything's built around their transit systems, you can't get much over 11% of transit, of person trips being handled by light rail or mass transit generally. So there's your range, folks, somewhere between 0.5% and 11%. There's nothing about those numbers or anything in between that will tell you that if you get the maximum diversion onto mass transit as you ever could, that it's going to have any impact on the amount of highway capacity that you need. Remember, you add additional lane, you've got a 100% increase in capacity. There's nothing else like it in all of mass transit. But you certainly can't take 10% off the road and say, oh, don't need any more highway capacity, that'll handle it. It's never been done that anybody knows of or can find, certainly never happened in the United States. So right now they're chasing after this impossible approach to handling this. You cannot transport enough people on mass transit, and we could have another hour-and-a-half seminar on why that is. I'm going to try to avoid going there. The first attempt to do an EIS for the full length between Basalt and Aspen, as I said, was carried out under the Department of Highways. Those guys were good. I mean, they knew how to get this stuff done, get it moving, and get highways built. And when they said, oh, sorry, we're going to have to bring in an expert on mass transit, they kind of shrugged and said, well, all right, we'll do that. They left behind a few presents for us. You know, something we could look at and say, yeah, I think I knew that all along, but thanks for mentioning it. But I'm going to back up again and see where we are up here on the big board. What we got? Oh, purpose and need, that's right. So back when they started the process and put out that first document in 1989, the purpose and need was to provide enough highway capacity and make it safe so people weren't killing themselves. After they were forced to limit the scope, so they were only doing Basalt to Buttermilk, they changed, I think, one word in the purpose and need. The portion from Buttermilk into town, which they now refer to as the entrance to Aspen, and that's how it was referred to in the whole EIS process, still had a lot of the same guys. I mean, you know, it's not a big state. There's only one department that handles this kind of stuff. And they were trying to now cope with the idea that they weren't even going to be able to use the same purpose and need. They'd literally call a section, not just a couple of statements, there's a whole section called purpose and need. And it ranges off in all directions. It's nothing at all like the very succinct statements made in the two other documents. But they did their best, and they worked their way through it, and they put out something. And by the way, when they put out that draft, and it looked like they were a few weeks away from being able to put out the final, they were pretty darn proud of themselves. They had two major issues. One was air quality. At the time, Aspen was a non-attainment area for PM10 pollution. And the second thing was they got this weird requirement that they've got to have a vote on the use of the open space. I don't think any of them had ever been through a public vote for a highway. That's not how it's done, you know. Well, the PM10 problem went away when a local department head, who was one of my all-time favorite heroes, looked at the problem of there being too much pollution in the air, completely redid the street sanding program, moved to harder material. They'd just been throwing dirt on the road for 50 years. Went to a harder gravel, went to much, much more regular street sweeping. You'll even see that today. I mean, you'll see street sweepers in this town more often than you do snowplows. And Aspen's no longer a non-attainment area. It was a simple physical problem. They applied simple physical solutions and got the air quality back in shape, at least as far as PM10, which was a bad one. It's particulates. Your lungs don't like that. So everybody's just as happy they did it, but they just applied themselves to the problem and solved it. Meanwhile, when they put their plan before the voters, after seeing all these stories about, oh, they can't make up their mind, and they got 67% of the people going, yeah, we want you guys to build us a highway, and yeah, we like your idea of putting it through the rural property, they were feeling pretty darn good about themselves, and they had every reason to. So I heard some, you know, they do all of their intake through public hearings, written comment. They've got a whole process that's built into the EIS process for finding out community input. They're not even allowed to run elections because everybody knows to the extent to which you can manipulate those. So again, the only reason there was ever an election, they would never have done it on their own, was the fact of, in order to move forward, the feds say you got to follow local law, and local law says you have to vote on the change of open space. So they were in very unfamiliar territory with all of that. And when they got that vote, ta-da! One of the longest EIS processes that anybody knew of in Colorado, at least, was about to come to a very fruitful close. So you can imagine they were not thrilled when the politicians got involved and said, no, we're just going to do Basalt to Buttermilk, and you guys are going to do a new process from there into town. They said, we just went through that process. Our recommendation was based on all the things you're supposed to take into account. What are we supposed to do this time around? I don't know, you'll think of something. But literally, they'd already finished it for the whole alignment. They're kind of going, okay, now what? Well, one of the things they did is did away with the purpose and need statement, expanded it to a whole section, clouded the water so badly, who knows what it means or what it's supposed to do. And at some point, the city came along and inserted their own list of project objectives. So now, instead of purpose and need, we've got project objectives. So there's another thing you can ask that federal judge. Really? Can you do that? It's all the same, all the same project. It had a purpose and need. Are we no longer going to fulfill the purpose and need? Or are we supposed to do that while we're now, accommodating all these, what did I just call them a second ago? And there's no answer to that either until you go ask a federal judge. I don't know who wants to do that. So here we are, we're trucking along on the new process. And we don't have a purpose and need statement anymore. We've got a purpose and need section. And that's what these are up here. And again, if you want to come back to Entrance Solution in about a week, there will be readable copies, and you can go through the whole thing. But they left us two gifts. Right there, they wrote into the basalt to buttermilk the need for 4 lanes. And they talk about the fact that you cannot divert enough traffic or person trips. That's the other thing. We had always talked about vehicles before. So one of the big innovations now is they switch from vehicle trips to person trips. And now we've got them, because if you run a train, you can potentially do a lot of person trips because you have all those seats. Doesn't mean you can fill the seats, but boy, you got all those seats. So they went ahead and they said, okay, we hired an outside consultant on this one because we didn't know what we were doing. And they basically told us that you can't get much above 11% in terms of diverted ridership or diverted person trips. 11%, said I. That's what Wendell Cox just told me a few months ago. So everybody who follows this stuff and looks at the actual statistics knows how many people will gladly give up their vehicle, at least for a trip or a couple of trips, and go ride on mass transit, and particularly light rail. And it's not enough to reduce the amount of capacity you need in your lanes to have the vehicle traffic move in such a way that you don't have huge traffic backups. So they wrote that into their final EIS before they put out their own record of decision for building the highway from Basalt all the way to Buttermilk. Well, they put that nice little note in there saying, well, you can't really do this because you're not going to improve traffic, the movement of traffic. You're not going to improve traffic congestion. And therefore, it's not going to solve project purpose and need. The court didn't take that up. They didn't say, well, can you proceed if you don't fulfill the original project and purpose and need? So we still don't have a federal judge that's answered that question for us. But the federal judge did say that in case of bus lanes, you absolutely do have to have an additional vote, because that's not what you asked the voters back when you got their approval to use open space. So under those circumstances, we do know that a federal judge, which means a lot to the state, thinks she had to get that approved. Well, they took it to the voters and they got it approved. And here's the fun part. They just went ahead and administratively changed the right-of-way agreement. The one where they had built in the idea that you had to have light rail. Well, now they just did it as a phasing thing. Well, we're initially going to have bus lanes, and later we'll put in the light rail. So just like that, the controlling document for all of this was changed to accommodate the bus lanes. The court said that's fine. The state went ahead and accepted it. If they hadn't, I guess they would have, I guess the city would have given their 33 acres back. I don't know what would happen under those circumstances. But we did find out one question by asking a federal judge, and that came out of the Friends of Merle Park lawsuit. So we keep trucking along on this, and we're getting nowhere. Nothing's happening. They build 2 additional lanes. They put buses on them. It does absolute squat for the traffic congestion because you're still narrowing 2 lanes down into 1 for general traffic and you don't have sufficient lane capacity. So that 52-year experiment took another step forward and failed just as badly as it had for the previous 45 years. And we still have a mess even though we have bus lanes. Didn't do a thing for the traffic. So now they're back there and they're going to do this again. They're going to ask people to put bus lanes through the Merle property and not expand the capacity for general traffic. And everybody knows, oh, you're going to use the Merle property, but you're not going to fix the traffic jam? Let's not do that. And it's going to get shot down as sure as hell. I mean, I'm not very good at crystal balls, but I just don't see any way that the local public, after all they've been through, is going to essentially accept, because the only leverage the local people have anymore is not to vote for anything until they come up with something that will actually relieve the traffic jam. As long as you keep saying no, maybe someday you'll get 3 reasonable people in there that'll give you an option you might want to support, which will actually relieve the traffic jam. But because HOV lanes, well, the other thing that's important in the Friends of Merle suit, the court pointed out, one, that was a fully evaluated option, bus lanes. Not only that, at one time, it was the preferred option. Well, look what they did down here. We have a fatal flaw analysis, which then leads to comparative screening. And you have all sorts of attributes here: alignment, laneage, profile, and mode. And what they did is they go along, you see the little arrows proceeding to the right, and you see a line that's much fatter than the rest, and on the other side of that line it says stop. Well, under alignment, no arrow makes it past the black line other than modified direct. Well, that was that illustration you've been looking at most of the evening, the one on the right where you just go through the Merle property. That's the modified direct. Laneage, 2 highway lanes plus 2 dedicated vehicle and or transit lanes. Well, hell, that sounds like a victory for the bus lane and train people, doesn't it? Except for one thing. Down below, they describe what modes they're talking about for your transit lanes. And the modes that are acceptable are guided busway. No, the guided busway isn't. That's a stop. Lo and behold, an HOV is an acceptable transit lane. And it's been fully evaluated as satisfying. Self-propelled buses, okay. Electric trolley buses, okay. Light rail. Let me explain that top thing where it says HOV. That's a description of the exact highway configuration we have between Basalt and Buttermilk. So under the record of decision for the entrance to town, the local elected officials are relying on as the proof positive that they got to have either bus lanes or light rail, says right there, you could just continue the existing highway configuration of 2-lane plus HOV lanes, 3 hours in the morning on the way up, 3 hours on the afternoon on the way down. Take that through the Merle property and connect it directly to the 7th Street, and it's already approved. It's already a fully evaluated option under the entrance to Aspen, the latest and greatest record of decision. And if anybody wants to go ask a federal judge to reconsider that, good luck, because you're going to have to get around the other judge who already decided it in the Friends of Merle case. You're going to have to overcome what is obvious 3-dimensional reality, which is this ain't working. So this is why it could, because whether or not this is doable has nothing to do with the federal process. The EIS is happy with HOV lanes all the way between Basalt and 7th Street. And they've said so. It's all controlled by that right-of-way agreement, which quite frankly, I don't know why the state ever agreed to that right-of-way agreement, which limits what they can do with the property they just traded for, but they did. So you could have a member of staff rewrite that thing just like they did when they got approval for the bus lanes, only this time you don't have to go to the voters. Your elected officials can just go ahead and do it. Why? because of that 1990 vote. The 67% who said, yes, we want a four-lane highway, and yes, we want it through the Merle property. Because the stipulations in that match point for point for mostly what everything has already been done. It asked for replacement property for everything that was taken. That's already occurred. That's why it occurred, is because of that vote. That's the reason they went ahead with the land exchange. There is nothing in the approval from 1990 that takes the highway all the way into town that relates to any objections that the judge had in the Friends of Merle. Because what they did was put together a right-of-way agreement for not only something that doesn't solve the traffic jam, so it's never satisfied the original purpose and need. At some point, I keep expecting the feds to come in and say, can we have our $200 million back? This is not what we signed up for. It's amazing how simple it is. It really is. If you know what to look for, there's nothing complicated here. It was like the time we got Wendell Cox to please do an analysis, the corridor investment study. This was preliminary to do a rail line all the way down Valley. You got back and just use their own graphs. What do you mean? Well, there's a level of service for the different sections of the highway. And he said, it doesn't matter what you're talking about, the build, the no build, rail, buses, bus lanes, none of them show any improvement in the level of service in any of those sectors. And he was right. Their own documents showed that if they did any of these things, it wasn't going to help. It wasn't going to relieve congestion. And I find that a lot. If you actually just read this, there's nothing more subversive than reading one of these documents when they're all done with them. Because invariably, they don't say what the administrators and the elected officials claim they say. And this is a classic situation here. Nobody wants to mention that, yeah, you could just go ahead and extend the existing highway in the configuration it's in, all the way to 7th Street, relieve the traffic jam. You wouldn't have any bus lanes anymore, of course, like we all know, if you have bus lanes, then you don't have enough general traffic capacity to eliminate the traffic jam, or at least significantly reduce it. So that's how complicated it really and truly is if you want to fix this mess. Michael, could we have another set of slides? I don't even remember where we're going with it. Oh, my favorite. Remember I talked about we didn't have a purpose and need anymore. We had project objectives. So I keep tapping my mic. I've got to stop doing that. This is a policy statement by a city council. It has no force or effect legally anywhere. Any subsequent council could either change this, continue to enforce it, or throw it out entirely. It has no business being in a record of decision. It certainly has no business being anywhere else because it has no force or effect. And they do that on purpose. They don't want the next council to come in and come up with a new list. Well, I got to do the whole process over again. No, that's not what they're into. But they mention in numerous places that the solution must address all these points. Well, of course it does. I've got a volume 2 down here. Let me find volume 2. It's a lot of fun. Oh, here's a volume 2. See this? That's all the comments they received during the course of the EIS. And they have addressed every one of them. In a lot of places, well, not every one, I think there's a few places where they missed. But typically, if there's a number of letters that are concerned with the same problem, but they've all been addressed. So the city keeps saying, well, they've got to address all these points. Okay, they did. I can pull it out for you and read every comment they made on each one of these points. They don't have to abide by it. They don't have to build to it. But there it is in the record of decision as though it were real. You can go to the State of Colorado website and download the same list. What's fun is when you do download it, you find out the name of the file. State of Colorado has posted these same list of project objectives, and the title for that file is City Insert. So no, it's got nothing to do with anything. Any subsequent council that wants to ignore these can. Some of these actually make me mad. They had supposedly decided they were going to hold traffic volumes in Aspen, Colorado to no more than how many vehicles were entering and leaving town in 1994. Does anybody here hate traffic? They're laughing at me. You don't hate traffic? He's loved it. She hates traffic. Okay. You realize you're engaging in self-loathing? Ma'am, you are traffic. Every time you leave your house to do something you need to do or go someplace you'd like to go, you're traffic. What you really hate is traffic congestion. And they've been, I mean, not just this jurisdiction, people all over the country have been jerking us around for decades over that difference. You don't hate traffic unless you like the idea of government, every time they say we're going to reduce or control traffic, are telling you they're going to limit your choices on where you can go and how often you can go there. That's what it means to limit traffic. Most people would like to be able to go where they want to go, and they think that government is there to provide the means to do that. But they're going to hold traffic to 1994 levels. And my original reaction was, the hell you are. You can't tell me where I can go when I want to go there. And I don't want to live in a country where we think the government has that right. So that one actually pisses me off. Sorry, I just ruined my own video. Anyway, these things are ridiculous, and they have done everything they can to make it look like this is a legal document. You can find it in the record decision. You can find it on the Colorado CDOT site. Any elected officials who don't want to operate under this don't have to. Now, if you go through and you look at all the responses, some of them are so generic, it's almost laughable. You know, we're going to have a safe and efficient highway. Well, yeah, the state will go along with that. The fact the state went along with this hold traffic volumes to 1994, it's like they knew it was meaningless. Why pick a fight? So they wrote in there, well, yes, but this would mean that the new highway is expected to operate under congestion. I want to say no S, Sherlock, but again, I'll ruin my video. So the state took it, and they fulfilled their responsibility to address these, and they did by pointing out the obvious, that this, again, won't satisfy project purpose and need, assuming there's still any need to do that, and we don't know that unless we want to go out and ask a federal judge. I would much prefer to have 3 city council members who would just say, we're tired of this. We can move forward with the same highway we have coming from Buttermilk to Basalt. So we're just going to make that decision. Just like the people back in 1970 did when they said, we're pulling the plug on the highway. They didn't vote. They didn't ask anybody. They told everybody that they didn't want the highway. As soon as they got in there, they got rid of it. And I already said, I see nothing to suggest that's going to happen this time around. I don't see 3 votes on there to do anything. They all want to study it some more. 52 years hasn't been enough. All this garbage down here. And keep in mind, this is what I personally collected. All this down here represents, maybe 5% of all the garbage that's been produced by all the consultants and all the staff people over all these years, rather than to just do the obvious. Once again, can't do the obvious because, well, I don't know, that's obvious. Now, I'm going to get on to Wagner versus City of Aspen. This was about the petition drive that we did. And petitions can only be for legislative subjects. They can't be for administrative subjects. Well, there's a big difference between the standards and how there used to be a big difference in the standards and how they're applied on a statewide issue as on a local issue. Because on a statewide issue, everything you do legislatively needs to affect everybody in the state more or less equally, across the board impact or application. Now, obviously, in a local setting, that's not possible. That would be like saying if you wanted, now the city can put whatever they want on the ballot. So they can put a question on the ballot, do you want to use open space for, and then put a whole long list of design standards or attributes that they want to enforce. Now, like I said before, I don't know why the state of Colorado ever accepted that. all those limitations on the land that they were about to trade for. Again, I think a federal judge would go, well, you can't have the public designing highways. They said they wanted to transfer the property. That's all you need to do. Go ahead and build the highway you want to build. The change in use is indeed administrative in character. Get this, reconfiguring lanes. Accordingly, we do not agree with the petitioner's assertion that the legislative amendment test applies to their proposals. And even if we were to apply the test, initiatives would fail. So you can't run an initiative. You can't go around and get signatures so people can vote on this, because it has to be handled by your elected officials and their staff, because it's administrative. So can you imagine going to a federal judge and saying, our elected officials can't choose amongst the options that have already been approved by the electorate. It's got to be voted on again. So it's going, well, if you already have 3 approvals to use the open space, we have the original one, the one with the bus lanes, and then that 1996 thing that had so many contingencies in it, I don't know how it ever led to a record of decision, because that seems to be in complete violation of the EIS process. I don't think a judge is going to do that. I think he's going to say, yeah, well, it's been fully evaluated. That's what you said you wanted all along. It's the preferred alternative, has been for 23 years. Yeah, I think your elected officials can make that decision. You got 3 approvals from the people. They are completely incompatible, mutually exclusive. And in that circumstance, the appropriate thing is to have your elected officials choose from among the 3. That's why I don't believe they mean it when they say, oh yeah, we got to get this, bus lane thing going and 2 lanes and eventually be phased into light rail. No, they want to get it voted down so they can keep it the way it is. It's that same 25% that has wanted nothing all along. Anyway, I love thinking about 52 years of history, all of that, all these meaningless votes. Like I said, there's only been 2 that meant anything. All this drama, all this kerfuffle. The Court of Appeals comes along and says, oh, you guys are just reconfiguring lanes. Kind of puts things into perspective, doesn't it? We've been fighting all this time over reconfiguring lanes, which, by the way, is what your elected officials are supposed to be doing. That's what they're charged to do. If you want to come up and look at all this stuff, it is hilarious. I mean, the fact you can generate all of this, and like I said, it can't even be 5% of the garbage that's been generated over all these years. That has nothing to do with the original problem. It's every tangent you can think of that every transportation consultant could devise, because the people who wanted nothing to happen love that. With that, again, I'm going to bid you adieu. Thank you all for being here. I don't want to do it again next year. I'm hoping someone will come on and break through this mess and fix it. In which case, all that crap down there on that table is really going to be irrelevant. Not that it isn't already. And who wants to load it all up so I can take it back to my car? Will you? I got 2 volunteers. What a great community. Good night, everybody. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Michael.